Hi there, it's Stuart Fensterheim, the couples expert, here for another edition of the Couples Expert podcast. We come every week to talk about relationships and how to have that wonderful, close, intimate relationship with that one person in the world who you know has your back. I wanted to talk about my weekend before I get to the podcast. This weekend I did something fun. I went to Outback's restaurant with my wife, Debbie, and we went to that particular restaurant because my daughter Sarah works there. And we had a wonderful dinner, and I left her a nice size tip, and she was really thrilled about that. But it reminded me of the story of when I did that a few months ago. And what I did a few months ago is I went there as a surprise. She knew I was coming this week, but I wanted to surprise her. I had never been there and seen her work. And I was really impressed by her, by the way. She really was good. She knew about the wine. She knew about the menu. I just had never really seen her in that kind of setting before. But what was really funny is I left her this huge tip because I knew she was struggling financially and I wanted to give her some money. So I put about a $50 tip on the check. But what I didn't know is that when you put the money on the check as a tip, they split it with the busboy and the other people in the restaurant. So what I learned is not to do that again. But we had such a good time on Saturday, and it just started me really reflecting, which is why I've decided to do this podcast all about Sarah and her struggles with some of the developmental delays that she has gone through. I am so happy to be able to really have an opportunity to talk about my child, Sarah. Sarah was born with a chronic illness, and her story is really what's at the center of this podcast. And after seeing her in action and thinking about her life and our family, I really think that there is a lot of learning that can be gained from Sarah's story, and more about attachments than anything. And I want to just really thank my daughter Sarah, who graciously agreed to allow me to talk about her this week. Her mom and I had some incredible challenges, fears, worries, joys, successes with Sarah in her 22 years of life, and I want to share those all with you. The podcast is about how a family's love and support can truly make all the difference when you're raising a child with a chronic illness. Sarah was born with Tracheoesophageal Fistula and Esophageal Atresia. What this means, it's an abnormal connection between the trachea and the esophagus. The condition is rare, and as you can imagine, impacts both Sarah's ability to eat and get adequate nutrition and her lung functioning. What's my hope in doing this podcast, in sharing her story, is that other parents of children with special needs or chronic illness will get some hope and inspiration from our experiences, because there's a lot here. Let me set the foundation of the podcast. Sarah's mom and I were in an incredibly loving marriage. We were a blended family, 2 kids from a previous marriage. She had been married before, and we were so incredibly happy. To give you an idea of what was going on at the time, if you remember the movie Aladdin, as parents of kids who were quite young, the song in the movie, A Whole New World, really resonated with the two of us. And we wanted to build a life of love, connection, and building a new life together. So the song Whole New World really made sense to us. And one of the things for me, though, what was really so very important, because I had not had children, was having a connection with a partner where we had a child together. And the two of us were going to raise this child in this incredibly loving relationship. However, as you can imagine, when we found out that she was pregnant, how excited it was. I remember the day that she surprised me with it, and we were just so ecstatic. There was nothing that was going to be more completing than having a child with the woman that I loved. And now we were going to have the kids, we were going to have us, and we were going to have something that I began to call our love child. Here's where it got tough. At about 27 weeks into the pregnancy, though, our world came crumbling down. Sarah's mom had developed what was known as one of the worst cases of polyhydramnios, which is too much amniotic fluid. The practice that we began to go to, the high-risk pregnancy practice, said that at one point she had the worst case of polyhydramnios that they had seen in quite some time. If you would have seen her by her size, she'd look like she was having triplets. What we learned prenatally was that our child had developed a blockage in her esophagus, and that the likelihood was that she would require immediate surgery upon delivery in the delivery room. What was going on was her trachea and esophagus was all messed up. And there was a risk, quite honestly, of her drowning in her own saliva. And you know, when I say that, it's sort of like, oh my gosh, it almost feels at times like I'm talking about someone else's life. But this was mine. And I began to sort of wonder, you know, is this some kind of sick joke that my child was going to have this kind of problem? No, that happens with other families. You know, I've seen the family down the block that has a kid that has these kind of problems, but not me. Are you kidding? And then on top of all of this, you know, matters just kept getting worse. We were told that if she'd even survived the pregnancy, she might not make it past a few hours old. So we would deliver her, love her, and about 12 to 15 hours later, she would die. And it was said to us like it wasn't even a maybe. As you can imagine, I mean, if you can even just imagine this, here I was, happy, in love, having a child, thrilled, and now being told that my child is going to die. We were a mess and not knowing what to do. You know, some of the doctors even began to talk to us about a late-term abortion. Having to, though, although they were saying, you have to go to another state, though, because Arizona would not allow it at that point. And the two of us, fortunately, so fortunately, the two of us had at least enough wits about us to begin to ask some questions. So many families, when they get information this horrible, just goes with what the doctors say. And we began to ask about where's their information coming from? What are the facts? Give us some specific things that we can understand. And the really hard part here is I respect doctors greatly. I have family members. My brother's a neurologist. But so many doctors really think they just know it all. And when we began to probe, well, we found out it was just a hunch. It was like he looked at some x-ray, some ultrasound, and made a determination without having all the facts. And we insisted, let's not make any decision. Please run these tests. And we literally had to argue with him about it. And it turned out she didn't have trisomy 13. She had tracheoesophageal fistula. Now, that was better, but that wasn't really very good. And I was so outraged with what had just happened, I almost couldn't even wrap my head around what was happening. And, you know, all I could do is just just pray that my child would survive. I am not a religious man, but I pray to God every single day that at least we'd make it to 37 weeks, because 37 weeks was actually considered full term. And at the delivery, and part of what was going on about the 37 weeks is we needed to get Sarah's mom and Sarah to that point because then her lungs would be developed and she might make it. The delivery was like a soap opera. I'll tell you that right now. You wouldn't believe it, because not only am I now having to deal with the fact that I have this child that may very well be born with some serious, serious problems, we decided that she would get an epidural during labor. And as I'm walking to the room, I see the anesthesiologist fast asleep outside the door. Not just asleep, but like crashed out. And I struck up a conversation with him and found out that he had been doing multiple operations and had been up all night, and he was just taking a quick snooze before the delivery. Are you crazy? You're going to stick a needle into my child's mother and you can't even keep your eyes open. I was freaking out about this. Then she went into labor and it was time to deliver my child. And there were like 10 people in the room. Not the most romantic, intimate time that I had envisioned for the delivery of my baby. The fate of my child was in their hands. There was an army in there. It wasn't just a few people. There were like 10. There was pediatric surgeons, there were doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, nurses assistant, physician assistants, every kind of doctor imaginable to help us deliver this child. And we were hoping beyond hope that the lungs were developed enough and she'd survive the surgery, because we knew they were going to have surgery. I cut the umbilical cord, which I was so thrilled about. And that was the last time that I was able to touch my child for many weeks. The surgery with Sarah was about 9 hours old. We left the hospital a couple of days later. And this is probably one of the more painful things of my memory with Sarah's birth, was that we left the facility without her. Now, let me tell you something. There's absolutely nothing more painful than leaving your child in the hospital in a neonatal intensive care unit and you were going home. We were going home. What we were told was that if we took her home and she needed to return for some reason, that she couldn't go back into the NICU, and that the kind of care she'd receive would be very different than the attentiveness that she'd get there. So she stayed. And approximately 8 weeks later, we took her home, but she was an incredibly sick child. But at least well enough to go home. At least we had that. The problems were she was unable to latch onto the breast, and all her feedings were going to be with a G-tube. Now, if you've never seen a G-tube is a tube that goes from the stomach out of her body, and you clip it at the end, and that's where you pour the formula, because she couldn't eat any other way. And it scared me to death that here we were having to do this feeding with the G-tube, and I knew nothing about this. What I did know, though, is my child was alive, and we were, as a family, going to get through this together. At least I hope so. What I would like to once again do, though, as I do this podcast, and I do this regarding connections, and I do this regarding love and relationships and attachments, is I want to just really thank Dr. Ken Pippis. And I believe he's no longer with Phoenix Children's, that he's now in Colorado somewhere, I think in the Denver area. I want to thank him for saving my daughter Sarah's life. When you have a sick child, all you can think about is getting her well. And most people think about the physical illness, and that the physicians are the ones that manage that. But when you have a sick child, the best medicine that most people forget about, and the real medicine, is the family. And that is what this podcast truly is about, how the connection of a family, the love of the people in the family, the importance of being in a relationship that's working, that's attached, that the kids and you and your partner really understand that you have each other's back, that those emotions, the love of the family, is really the best medicine. Not just the doctors, but the family is really what's going to heal a child with chronic illness. There are so many stories that I could tell you about Sarah and the things that we've been through with her in the first few years, such as the developmental psychologist who was able to give her a diagnosis that allowed us to have early intervention in the home, that allowed her to develop some of the insights and the ability to deal with coordination and things like that, that if they hadn't worked with her as a baby, she'd never have gotten through some of this. And the respiratory therapist, the physical therapist, and general practitioners all were just so invaluable in helping us. But that love that her mom and I had for her, and the love of her sister, her brother, her grandparents, cousins, is really what got us and Sarah through this initial ordeal. A baby in the NICU without being able to be touched by her family is a real tragedy. And that's what we were told. We were told that she was born, that she survived the surgery, but that we could not touch her. We could not stroke my child. I could not help her know that her family was here, and that without feeling the warmth and the love that we had for her, how would she know that we were there? We could not touch her. The only solace that we had with all of this was that we saw what was happening and that the nurses were able to touch her. When she finally came home, she was just so fragile. And at times, we felt what we could do is cause her more harm than good. And I didn't want to cause a problem for her. So as we're getting her home, I'm panicking about this. That lasted about 10 minutes. And then I realized, and I thought about it, and I said, to heck with this. Our love will get her through, because there's no one that loves her more than her mom and I. We knew what she needed more than anything is her mom and dad's love. That attachment was going to be the answer. And this was even before I knew about emotionally focused therapy. Since her birth, Sarah's undergone about 19 surgeries as we speak, thousands of tests, has taken many ambulance rides to the hospital, and probably the worst time in my life was when she was put into a medically induced coma. We've spent many years not knowing if she was going to thrive, let alone growing into an adult. If Sarah and mom and I hadn't had that strong connection and loving family, I don't know if we'd been able to handle some of this, particularly as well as we did. Many families are blown apart by this, and we definitely had challenges within ourselves in the relationship. But the one thing we never did is blame each other for Sarah's problem. And that definitely could have happened and does happen a lot for lots of families. What's important here is blame doesn't help you. All it does is it makes both people feel all alone and like you don't matter. One of the things that her mom and I really recognized early on is that we needed information. We needed to know what we're dealing with. We needed to know about the short-term consequences and long-term consequences for Sarah and our family. One of the best resources that we did come across, not so much for information, but helping us really put a perspective of what was going on and an understanding, was a poem that was written by a woman with an autistic child, I believe. And the roller coaster ride and the resistance that we all have in dealing with all of this really was helped tremendously by this. And it was something that I continue to use every day. It's a poem called Welcome to Holland, and I'm going to have some information of it in my show notes. But for so long, one of the things that kept coming up to me is, why did this happen to my child? Why couldn't I be one of the lucky ones to have a normal child? And then I realized something. I realized that I was one of the lucky ones. I am the lucky one. But how? How do I get through this? What I began to recognize is that having a normal child wouldn't allow me to really appreciate what I do have. And that after all these trials and tribulations, that I was one of the lucky ones. Other families don't get to have some experiences that I do, because what you end up doing when you have a seriously chronically ill child is you appreciate the small moments much more than other families do. The celebrations that Sarah's mom and I got to have, the intensity that comes with these celebrations is exponentially greater than any family celebration that normal children get to have. Things like the first word, the first step, her first ability to eat a solid piece of food. When we stopped having to feed her baby food because it was all mushed up. And to this day, Sarah can't stand bananas. And I think it's because the food that she was able to eat, the baby food we gave her, were mostly bananas. And now she's sick of it. She ate banana baby food every single day for a while. You see, what we were told after the initial surgery is that she would never be able to eat like a typical normal person ever, and that she'd struggle for years and would never be able to eat without her G-tube. So you get to appreciate the small things. She also has kicked many people in the shins who told her that she couldn't do something. She's always proved them wrong. As a family and parent, you have to believe in the power of your love to your child and know that no one will ever be more committed and devoted than you will be. And this poem of Welcome to Holland, I urge you to read in the show notes that are coming with this podcast. But make sure you have a box of Kleenex right next to you, because you will be overcome by the emotions that will come up. And even as I think about this poem, I have goosebumps. Welcome to Holland is a story of you wanting to go on a trip somewhere. And you're planning this trip. You buy a ticket. You have your passport. You're getting ready to visit Germany. You got your Deutschmarks and you've got your dollars converted and Rick Steves' guide in your hand, and you board that plane. And as you're about to touch down, pilot gets on and says, "Welcome to Holland." You go, "Wait a minute. I don't want to go to Holland. I want to go to Germany. Holland's not where I wanted to go. Holland's not what I talked about and planned and devoted myself and was excited about." You're really upset because you expected it to be something. You wanted to have the experience that other people have had. You want to see Germany, not Holland. It's not fair. Then you look around and you see that, oh, wait a minute. There's a couple of really nice things about Holland. People are smiling. Scenery is pretty good. And you make a decision to go with the flow and enjoy your stay and appreciate what they have to offer. Dealing with this is much like having a child with a chronic illness. It's the same thing. It would never, ever, ever have been our choice to have a sick child. We wanted only the best. But still, that's what we had. And having this sick child was something that we only wanted what's best. This is the life that we were given. And we wanted to appreciate everything that the world had, that she could have. And she ended up being this wonderful, incredible kid with a beautiful heart. And what a gift she is. We adapted to it. And what we needed to do as parents is to give her the best trip through this life that she had and have her appreciate every moment and every situation throughout her lifetime. But no visitor's guide here. We had to make it up as we went along. And looking back over these 22 years, it's been an incredible experience. I want to give credit to Emily Pearl Kinsley for her poem on raising a child with a disability and the inspiration that she gives to us. You know, parents with special needs kids are out there hanging out on their own. When Sarah were born, we didn't know anything about this. Don't wait for someone else to take advantage. There was no support for us or other families who were going through this. So we took the bull by the horns and said, no support group? Boom, we're creating one. And we created one of the first local chapters of the EATEF Foundation here in Phoenix. It's a national organization based out of Chicago, I believe. In researching the resources, we came across some of this. There's more than just medical issues. Parents question themselves, feel guilty, and you need to be informed. You need to recognize that you truly are the only true advocates for your child. And if you recognize that, you have to be the one that protects them and be there for them. As Sarah grew, the challenges grew along with her. And some got even really tough and worse. Sarah was pretty rambunctious as a toddler, and in every way made it hard for us. She took many rides in the ambulance, pulled out her G-tube, trying to get out of her crib at 18 months, and also swallowed 5 marbles, which miraculously, due to the constriction of the esophagus, lined up all in 5. And if I can find it for the show notes, I'm going to give a photo of the x-ray that will allow you to see the marble sitting there. It's a pretty amazing picture. And if Facebook was around back then and we posted it, I guarantee it would have gone viral. Because of Sarah's illness, the other thing that happened is that we couldn't send her to a preschool. So her mom decided that she couldn't go back to work and ended up putting together a preschool in our home for kids with developmental delays. She learned about that. She learned about how to run a preschool. And it became quite a successful preschool in our home for kids with special needs and kids who needed some extra attention before getting off to kindergarten. So one of the things that happened as a result is Sarah also learned how to get ourselves out of trouble and to be a bit sneaky. And one of those bit her in the butt, because what she ended up doing when we were on a trip to Washington, D.C., one of the things that Sarah had learned through the years is she learned how to eat and how to make herself throw up, which were two things she wasn't supposed to be able to do. She wasn't able to eat regular food. But what she ended up figuring out is that because of the lack of motility in the esophagus, which is the pulsating of the esophagus that brings food to the stomach, if she could swallow air and use gravity, she'd be able to eat things that she normally couldn't. And it worked. But when we were on this trip, one of the things that she liked was Shirley Temples. It's the drink without the liquor, because they liked cherries. But cherries was something she wasn't supposed to eat. So what ended up happening is one of the things we learned, that if something got stuck in her esophagus, Coke, not Pepsi, it had to be Coke, would help dissolve it. But she ate something, and while she was eating this cherry, her older brother and sister cracked her up and made her laugh. And she swallowed it whole, which was really bad. And the cherry got stuck. And she didn't want to tell us what she had done because she was worried she'd get herself in trouble. And we were at this family function, and there was a blizzard. It was one of the worst snowstorms Washington, D.C. had in quite some time. And Sarah, once again, made us recognize that life isn't too boring. We ended up on an ambulance ride, but they couldn't get the ambulances to us because they were snowed in. So we ended up having to get other people, including the chef and the bellboy and different people who had a truck, took us to the ambulances, which then took Sarah to the hospital, which allowed her to surgically have the cherry removed. There are many, many stories like this that Sarah has been through. One of them was she was at a dentist, and one of the things that we learned early on is that she shouldn't be put back because she needed to be upright. And the dentist didn't pay attention to us. And as a result of that, she ended up getting an infection from the cavity, and she aspirated it into her lungs. And as a result of this, we ended up in the hospital again, and they attempted to clean up the infection and accidentally punctured her lungs, which then required them to put her into a medically induced coma. When she was in this coma, they told us that they weren't sure she'd ever come out because both lungs were infected. And I prayed again. This was probably the worst experience of my entire life, even more so than when she was an infant, because here was this child that I loved. She was 13 years old. And I couldn't believe it. 13 years we got. And here she was in this coma. We got her through the worst time as an infant, and we were going to lose her. I can tell you right now, when you have a child that's in that kind of situation, you promise them anything, and I did. I promised her that I'd never punish her again if she would just get up, wake up, and come home to us, which she did. She beat the odds again. And I told Sarah I lied to her. No, you may not go out and stay out at all hours. No, you will not have boys in your room. So I had lied. She did get herself in trouble, but she's turned out to be this incredibly wonderful kid and adult. When Sarah was in the coma, it was a huge lesson to me. And I think it's a huge lesson to all of you about advocating for your sick child. I happened to be in the hospital room when a nurse came in to suction the lungs. She was one of the first people on a double ventilator. and they were suctioning her good lung, or was about to suction her good lung, with the same tubing that they had just put in the infected lung and was about to go into the good lung. And I said, wait a minute, are you supposed to use that same tube that you had there? And they said, oh, I guess you're right. Shouldn't do that. They would have cross-contaminated the healthy lung. And I spoke up and stopped it from happening. You have to be there for your child. Nurses and medical professionals are only human. Throughout the years, Sarah has grown into this incredible woman. And Sarah's mother and I really, I think, can pat ourselves on the back because we truly set her up for success by treating her condition as something that she just needs to deal with. Doesn't make her any that much more special, and that she never was allowed to use it as an excuse of why she couldn't do something. This disorder is going to be with her the rest of her life, and that's just the way it is. And there's no sense and no point in our wishing it away, because it's not going to happen. I spent some time talking to Sarah before doing this podcast because I went back and forth for quite a while of whether I wanted to do it. As a matter of fact, initially, I was going to have her on the show. I was going to invite her in as a guest, but then sort of felt sort of weird about doing that. So decided that I would interview her and talk with her about some of the things that had gone on for her and her feelings about it. And what she wanted me to share is that if you treat a child as if they're damaged goods, or by spoiling or cuddling them, they're going to grow up believing that that is their destiny. It is through the power of love and the connection that Sarah has with myself and her mom, along with her older brother, 2 sisters, and everyone in her life, that's really allowed her to be a normal 22-year-old woman, now in school and living on her own, working toward being a nurse. As a 22-year-old young adult, she still calls her mom all the time, as any 22-year-old would. But it's about the things that most 22-year-olds call their mom and dads about. Her disorder has caused her to be able to meet most of the challenges that's come her way head on. She makes choices about her diet and some of the risks that come with that she's very aware of. And she has an incredible capacity for being compassionate toward other people. One of the things that was life-changing for Sarah was when she did have her coma. She met an ICU nurse who made such an impact on her and inspired her to follow in the footsteps. And Sarah now is in nursing school, and she reaches out to families of special needs, kids with that same disorder that she has, and gives them hope. She actually has turned out, and she's now a poster child for a website called Christie's Courage, and I urge you to check out their website. It provides elevated cribs and beds for children with EATEF. And since she knows how to get out of those things, I'm glad that that's what she's promoting. And I wanted you all to be aware that if you want more information on tracheoesophageal fistula and those other related disorders, in the show notes will be a resource and a link for you to go to the weareat.org. It's a website, it's a federation of support groups where you can get help and more information on these rare eating disorders. For Sarah, the love and support of her family really has been the thing that has helped to get through. Her mom and I advocating for her, protecting her, I hope we made the right decisions for her. Only she can answer that, I guess. And now, as a young adult living on her own, she makes thought and intelligent decisions, and I'm proud of the decisions she makes. She's really a light in my life, along with her sister. And I can't wait till she finishes nursing school, because she will have a story to tell people, and she'll have the ability to influence many people throughout her life, helping with the compassion she has for those, the nurturing, the caring part of who she is. And the input that she's had on this podcast and how she's collaborated with me and approved what I've done, I just want to thank her once again. I think she's an incredibly brave soul to share some of these really intimate details of her life with you. So, Sarah, I love you incredibly. Thank you very much for giving to my audience, giving of yourself, giving of your time in nursing school, because that's not easy. And just thank you, all of you, for joining me on this podcast to really allow me to share my daughter with all of you. And we'll see you all next time. And as always, please stay connected. Bye-bye.